We appreciate you guys being here today. We currently have 27 people on board. We had about 40 registered. Once we get rolling here, I would appreciate it if everybody muted themselves. And just to let you know, we will record this session and it'll be sent out to everybody within CORFAC. I'd like to give a special thank you. I don't know whether you heard Will and Todd introduce themselves from Louisville. Now, they are right now going through the approval process with CORFAC as a new CORFAC office, and we invited them to participate in this session. So I'm sure it's all the application is going to go through smoothly, Will, and all that good stuff, but welcome. Thrilled to have you here.
Thank you.
So without further ado, Mason and Al, thank you very much for agreeing to put this program together. Mason and Al are from our CORFAC office in Detroit. Mason is one of the principals there, and Al oversees their property management function. So take it away.
Yeah, so I know just about everybody on the call, but I'm Mason Capitani. So I'm one of the principals, as Jonathan mentioned, of Mason Capitani. And I'm getting a little bit of feedback from somebody. Anyway, and we have a property management arm. Jason and I have a partner, El Shulin, who's also on the call, who basically runs our day-to-day operation of our property management company, which is known as Liberty Property and Asset Management. It's a separate company, but affiliated in that, a fair number of the properties that we lease and handle from a brokerage standpoint, we also manage, and vice versa. We really specialize in managing office and medical properties. Right now, we manage approximately 40 buildings, just under 2 million square feet. The purpose of the session here is really to be interactive and to talk about and review some practices, best practices that we are incurring and that we're coming across. It's a changing landscape, and it's changing on a daily basis, especially as companies start to begin the process of going back to work. So it's an education for us to try and understand what the needs are of tenants, what the requirements are of the various states, obviously Michigan in our case, CDC requirements, best practices. So the purposes of this was to roll through some of the things that we're seeing, and obviously hear from other people as well, whether it be questions or comments on what they're seeing in their respective markets, so that we can all learn from this. So Al, did you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Good afternoon, everybody. Al Shulin, President of Liberty Property and Asset Management. So look forward to being on the call and answering whatever questions and just having some good dialogue on what we're all seeing as going forward and how we're going to reopen. So with that, Mason, I'll let you take the lead.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first point on our slideshow here is adjusting operations in light of COVID-19. And this really has to do with, okay, most states are getting back to work to various degrees. And how are we preparing, and how are things changing in the buildings that we manage to accommodate tenants coming back, at least in the initial term and then moving forward? So some of the things that we've seen, and I'll kind of take the lead and then defer to Al to possibly add to what I have to say. We manage quite a few medical buildings, and those buildings, in many respects, never actually shut down. They operated right through the pandemic and through the work stoppages. We're seeing a lot of buildings that are tenants, medical tenants especially, that are taking and putting into effect their own protocols. For instance, you come into some of these medical buildings, you have to have your temperature taken before you can enter the building, fill out a questionnaire, screening, those sort of things. And from a management standpoint, it's important for us to communicate with the tenants and make sure that we work with them to make sure that these different programs are instituted. Other things that we're seeing in general office buildings, and I'm sure many of you probably have seen it if you have gone out and visited buildings within your respective markets, but we're closing common areas, we're closing sundry shops and lobbies, taking lobby furniture out of buildings, gyms, common area conference rooms, any kind of grab and go food areas or break rooms, those sort of things, we're completely closing off for the time being, with the understanding that hopefully they'll reopen soon. But we're taking those steps not only because the tenants asked for it, but also because we're required to do so. Some of the other things that we're doing is it's important to install prominent signage throughout the buildings, indicating what our policy is. For instance, I have a building in Auburn Hills, Michigan, where the policy is 2 people per elevator. And we actually have stickers on the floor in the building showing where to stand. You know, some people might not follow this, but it shows a proactiveness on the part of the management company to try and do everything that we can do to be safe and to follow the rules and the guidelines. One of the other things, and Al, you're doing this at many of the buildings, is to install hand sanitizer stations in lobbies and in different common areas and points where tenants are coming in and out of the building. Another suggestion is we have signs placed for ingress and egress. Certain doors and stairwells are intended for going up or coming in and going down or going out of the building. Again, whether or not people follow the signage is another thing, but from a management standpoint, we're trying to be as proactive as possible. Al, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, we also, you know, in the public area restrooms, we've eliminated urinals that are next to each other. We have eliminated, you know, sinks so that we're every other sink in the restrooms. We've eliminated drinking fountains. We've marked them out. We basically caution tape them off. So it, you know, looks halfway presentable, but so you can't use it. And we've notified the tenants via email why we're doing it to keep social distancing in mind. We've also had our staff that's in the buildings, our maintenance techs and our day porters, you know, hitting all the frequently touched surfaces, i.e. elevator buttons, door handles in and out of the buildings, door handles into the restroom, tenant suites. So we're, you know, we're using the disinfectants and hitting those frequently touched surfaces multiple times per day as we're going through the buildings.
And I just to point out, I would encourage, if you have any questions, anybody on the call has any questions or comments, please use the chat box. We're monitoring that and we're going to address any questions. And I would encourage, if anybody else is instituting any practices in their given market, anybody who's involved in management, we'd love to hear from you throughout the call, and we want this to be interactive as much as possible. So the big question moving forward is, as the buildings repopulate, what changes do we see? How do we adapt to what's going on? It's fairly easy to institute these different policies that we're enacting when the buildings are 10% occupied, which is in many cases still the case. Even as different states open and the policies loosen up, especially many corporate tenants, have decided to delay reoccupying the buildings. I can tell you here in the Detroit area, most of the automotive companies are not going to come back till October, November, possibly even till the end of the year in many instances. And even if they do come back, they're coming back on a very limited basis. So for those properties that are running, like I said, at 10 or 15% occupancy, it's easier to institute these different policies. As the buildings get closer to 100% occupancy, and then you've got issues with ingress, egress. I can tell you one common complaint that we're already starting to see is we ask people to wear masks in the buildings. We post signage asking for everybody to observe the rule. Not everybody does. And we get common complaints from tenants saying, you know, so-and-so was in the building and they weren't wearing a mask. Do something about it. Well, obviously we're instituting a policy, but there's only so much we can do. And Al, maybe you can speak to how you've handled those situations.
So, you know, and again, we did have this in one of the buildings where we had one group of attorneys real upset with another group of attorneys. We did send out a reminder email to everybody in the building. You know, part of the CDC guidelines, part of the state come back to work policies is here's what you need to do. Fortunately, I knew the person that wasn't wearing the mask, so I was able to text him, have a conversation with him. And some people are thinking it's a political choice. Well, I'm not wearing a mask because the government requires me to. Other people are just like, well, I didn't have time. So when I talked to this specific tenant, they were going to, instruct their people, hey, get the masks on, keep them on. We need to keep a happy work environment. But part of it is your relationship with your tenants and talking to them and explaining that, look, we're not here to, make the rules. We're just enforcing the rules that are in play. And we all want to get back to work. So if this is what it costs and requires us to get back to work, wear the masks and let's get back to work. So we were able to sort of diffuse it. But, we had another instance in a medical building where I had a day porter in hand, and we found out about this after the fact. It was an ophthalmology clinic, and the patient would not put a mask on. The patient was asked to leave and refused to leave. And the tenant did call the police, and the police did respond. They did come out, and, nothing happened. I guess they could have trespassed him off the property, which, would have instituted a ticket. But it did happen where it was, such this political statement, and you try to de-escalate it as best you can and just kind of get everybody on the same page. But I know we're all going to see this as people start ramping back up, how we're going to deal with, instituting the rules that the state and the CDC has, asked us to do.
Yeah, it puts us in a very precarious situation because, we don't have the authority or certainly the power to make people do something they don't want to do. All we can do is provide guidelines and communicate the best we can. And I think a lot of it, Al, is going to be troubleshooting, and just when somebody complains, you just have to address the concern the best you can. And, but we can't, obviously, we're not the police. We can't sit there in the building and not allow somebody to come in if they don't have a mask on. And number one, we don't have the manpower to do that, and it's just not practical. So communication, I think, is key, don't you think?
Absolutely. And the other thing we have done is Liberty's gone out and procured, a boatload of masks. So with our maintenance staff has masks, our office has staff. So if somebody's in the building working for the building and they don't have a mask, we're providing one and as a requirement to work in the building or work around the building, that they wear a mask, just so that we keep ourselves, adhering to the rules, and all the vendors and trades that work for us.
Does anybody on the call have any questions or comments on this first section?
Hi, this is Carol from Las Vegas. Maybe just a question or a comment, I'm not sure. The issue that we're running into is the requirement versus suggestion. And like you gentlemen, you both have said, we're not the police. And what we're finding is that in some areas they're saying we're suggesting. And so to the extent they're suggesting, we're just saying, gosh, please, dictate what you believe to be the best. However, for our vendors, our third-party vendors, we absolutely, and Al, I think you said it, that the vendors, you can require them to wear the masks. So outside of that, again, with the tenants, and everybody has their, the fear is real. And some people are heightened, more fearful than others. And when we have the tenants push back on us, we want to show compassion, but outside of saying, gosh, here's the guidelines, and, handle yourself accordingly. I'm not sure that there's much more that we've been able to do and be successful at.
Again, Carol, I would agree with you 100%. It's all about your relationship with your tenants and your other tenants to try to get them to somewhat comply. And again, some of the times you're having, it's a political statement, right? They don't want to do it because the government's telling them they have to do it. It's going to be some trying times here going forward, but yeah, you got to keep good tenant relations for both tenants, the one that's not complying and the one that is, and just try to work that through. And as we do, we're always the ones digging ourselves out of, the trash. So that's what we have to do on this one as well.
And just another question as it relates to masks, I like to say physical distancing, not social distancing, because we're all people and we like that human interaction. As it relates to our industries that we represent, whether it's IREM, BOMA, CREW, whatever it is, are you guys seeing anytime soon that you will be going back to in-person meetings? And if and when that happens, are you requiring or just suggesting and encouraging your members to wear masks? Feedback on
So
that.
we have had face-to-face meetings throughout COVID. As Mason indicated, we do manage a lot of medical buildings that were never closed. So we were up and running, and we were using, I have a box of masks in my car. I have a box of gloves in my car, so that if I go into a meeting and I know there's 4 people, I'm bringing 4 masks with me, to try to, and most people have been wearing the mask, and we've been still, keeping that distance, but also wearing masks when we've been in a room together and things like that. But we have had face-to-face, and we have done that just because it, in our job, a lot of times it's required, so I have kept the masks along, encouraged our maintenance staff, our maintenance engineers, our property managers to keep box of masks with them as well, to just encourage it when they are meeting with tenants and or vendors or something. Obviously vendors, we control them, it's a little easier, but tenants, we tend to bring masks in, and some of them wear them and some of them don't,
Yeah,
So-
Al was pretty proactive actually when COVID first started, and we very beginning stages of the lockdown, the shutdown. Al, you did pretty well. You I don't want to use the word hoarded, but you definitely gathered a lot of PPE, and we had contractors and vendors that couldn't get their hands on masks early on, and we provided them for them because we felt it was important, obviously.
How about for the industry lunches, like BOMA, IREM Crew, NAOP? What are you guys seeing there in the future?
They've all been at this point in Michigan. They're I've seen them all keep pushing off. I mean, we're not open to some of the other states. We're hoping to be by the 4th of July, be for the most part opened back up. But we have not seen any of those things come back yet.
So those meetings are virtual. Do you have your
virtual,
lunch?
all venture, yeah, all virtual. Yes, absolutely.
How about other states?
Yeah, I can't speak to other states. That Michigan is I'm sure many people might have seen in the news. We've got a governor here who has imposed quite a strict lockdown, and it's just starting to lift. So I know other states, Texas, Georgia, Florida, definitely relaxed their rules a lot quicker than we have. So I can't speak to those states, but I know just here in Michigan, we're just starting to open up businesses again. And restaurants just opened, Al, a week ago?
A week ago, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and at a very limited scale. So, so to answer your question, Carol, all of those meetings, those trade meetings are virtual. I can tell you, just from a property management / brokerage standpoint, I've had a lot of face-to-face meetings, and frankly, I've had a lot of meetings with people that didn't wear masks, and I almost always wear one just because I don't want to offend somebody, and it's the right thing to do, I think. That's my own personal feeling, but I also have a hard time telling somebody you have to wear one if they're not wearing one. It's difficult for me to do that. And, certainly when you're running a building and you've got vendors, like we've already said, those people, they work for you, you can tell them they need to wear a mask. But when you have a tenant or a client or a prospective client, it's hard to say, hey, I'm not, put on your mask. It can put you in a precarious, uncomfortable situation, but you deal with it the best you can.
And to elaborate on that, the other thing that's happening in the state of Michigan is when we're opening back up, as things are opening back up, we're not getting, here's what we're suggesting you do when you open. They announce 3 days from now you're going to be allowed to open, with very little. All the guidance is coming after the fact. So I think that's why a lot of our, BOMAs and IREMs and things are kind of sitting back going, all right, we don't even know where things are going to be, because we're not getting the direction from our governor the way we would think we would. So. Yeah.
For instance, our governor came out with I don't think it's been enacted, but they're floating a test balloon out there that as we open up office buildings, they're going to require office tenants and companies that all of the employees are stationed 6 feet apart from one another. When you're in a cube farm workstation environment and it's in place, that's easier said than done. And I guess from a management standpoint, that's not for us to impose on the companies. That's for the companies to impose on themselves. But one good example is, Al, we have a large logistics company in Auburn Hills, Michigan, in the building we manage. and they have reached out to us. They have a combination of private offices, nice, highly upgraded boardrooms, but also cube farm environment. And they've reached out to us. Al, you've got a meeting with them later this week or next. I can't remember what, but
This week, yeah.
they're going to redesign their space at their cost and ask us to build it for them. So we're starting to see some of that too. You know, this is a long-term tenant. They've got many years left on their lease, and they're going to spend the money to somewhat rebuild their space. So, you know, it's just a matter of servicing the tenant's needs as they come up. Any other questions or comments?
I don't know if I can give you an insight from France, but where I suppose the United States, but maybe 4 weeks on, because we've come out of lockdown, and I don't know what lessons I'd give you that way. The confinement was fairly standard. We look after some office buildings, industrial, and a few other things, and so we found our industrial buildings went into lockdown. You could no longer visit very easily. But that was fine. Office buildings, we were applying some of the things you've mentioned and putting stickers in lifts and all that. That went well. But perhaps we have different rules on it, but something to watch out for. We came out of confinement in the Paris region only 1 week ago. We came out on the 4th of June, but we opened our restaurants and everything else. What was normally a very well-behaved French population, which is hard to imagine, and adhere to confinement rules very well, they have gone banzai in France in restaurants and terraces. So you go past restaurants now in Paris. It's June. It's lovely weather. It is heaving. No one is a meter apart. There's a few masks around. There are restaurants you could hardly get in the door with the mass of people, even though we're all meant to have tables 2 meters apart. That's the one thing we have to suffer. The other one that's changed a lot is our offices. So we have very different employment rules to you in the States. And we have a workers' council, a union that is very strong. So we have, now we don't manage these big buildings, but we have big towers in La Défense. La Défense is the Europe's largest office area just west of Paris. And I mean, I'm looking after the possibility of buying a share from Madison of a 61,000 square meter tower. So that's what, 610,000 square feet. So not a small one, with a $35 million rent bill. But there, not the tenants, who happen to be Deloitte and AXA Investment Management, but the Workers' Council and then the health and safety of the building have now deemed that is a maximum occupation of 20% only. So I'm trying to think of the figures are 2,000-3,000 people. Normally, they can only put 300 to 500 in the building. It's beginning to have an impact, I think, on the future values. People think, what is the point in having a tower? In that it's viewed as a little bit at the moment of an incubator of disease. So that's a very difficult one to manage. I mean, we on our side, we've bought a lot of masks. We've bought about 6,000 masks. We've started giving them to some of our tenants, certainly our retail tenants, our antique shops, and all that. We look after an antique market near Versailles. We've generally, perhaps we would get onto that subject, but we are not required to give rent freeze. The law now requires you to defer rental payments. So we were locked down from the 15th of March to the 4th of June, and that period it can be proposed. We've given that rent. We've chosen on certain buildings to give that rent away for free without reclaiming it in certain buildings which are retail, and then in offices we've tended to postpone we've postponed the repayment of that. However, I mean, just in general about COVID, I mean, we're not on that subject, but today is far too early. It's mid-September, October, November that we begin to see the economic impact of this. So there's a lot of people, vainly, my French colleagues, who think, oh, we've put off Q2 rental income, we'll pick it up in Q3 and catch it up in Q4. There isn't a cat and hell's chance of getting that money back. There's an economic bubble bursting at the moment in France. It'll be the same in America. So I would advise a lot of people, and we've got many clients that follow us, we've been incredibly generous. We've done the lobbying, we've been to see the local mayors, they know that we're the right sort of people. And that's, I think, quite important, because in France, when people aren't happy, we set fire to buildings. And so it's a little more dangerous than in America, but we've been ahead of the curve on that in sort of people handling. And I think a general approach of hands-on management, being seen all the time, sounds like that's exactly what you're doing all the time. Giving out masks, well done for turning up at meetings with spare masks for the other attendees. But my God, it's so important to be seen to do the right thing. I think going back to the legal side of it, none of the elements we do will save lives or are proven to save lives, but they'll save litigation. I suppose we're protecting ourselves by being seen with signposts on buildings and the right sort of things, just in case somebody gets litigious in the next few months.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill. I that's the other side of it that we're going to have to see is the legal ramifications of some of these actions that you do or don't take. And it's all of our societies are somewhat litigious, so it's important, as you had mentioned. Are these measures going to actually make a difference? They might not, but as perception is reality, and that's our approach for sure. And the other thing is, it's all relative. In Detroit, at least for our portfolio, many of our buildings are mid-rise buildings, single-story, 5, 6, 7-story buildings, and all in between. I can only imagine in a city like Paris or New York, where there's mass transit and where if you're in a 70-story high-rise office building, how are people going to get to their office and go up and down elevators? There's various degrees of how do you deal with these sort of things? And I don't know the answers to those things, and I'm not sure that anybody does. But it's a changing landscape, and you have to try your best to adapt to it, I guess. Any other comments before we switch to the next slide? No? Can we switch to the next slide? So we've already talked a lot about some of this, but you know what? I think we skipped one. Did we skip the working with vendors? There we go. So we talked a little bit on the tenant side, interacting with tenants, interacting with our vendors. There's higher standards that our vendors and suppliers are being required to live up to, specifically janitorial. And Al, maybe you can speak to some of the different requirements that we put in place to heighten disinfecting the buildings, the different standards that we're asking now of our janitorial crews in the buildings. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. So, obviously frequently touched surfaces, door handles, doorknobs, restroom handles, those are being done at night as well with the products, and making sure they're getting the proper training, because all of your disinfectants have to remain wet on the surface for a duration of time, preferably a minute plus, to work effectively. So wiping on and wiping off doesn't necessarily work effectively. So you're retraining your staff with that. And then you also, in turn, you've got to let your tenants know that we intentionally left that doorknob wet, or we intentionally left that door handle wet, or that faucet in the, because those frequently touched surfaces do have to remain wet with the cleanser for them disinfectants to work properly. One of the things that we as a company have been going to and having our owners switch over to is really touchless restrooms. So most of our restrooms already have automatic soap, hand towels, and faucets. So that's helped out there, as well as urinals and toilets flushing themselves. But those surfaces have to remain, wet when you turn it. So when somebody walks into the restroom, well, there were streaks all over the handle for the urinal. Well, that's because when you put the disinfectant on, you can't wipe it off, or you didn't get you didn't get it working properly. The other thing is working with your heating and cooling companies and making sure they're, all your filters are properly changed out. Do we need to go in and clean some evaporator coils and things of that nature? So we're working through that as well. So, yeah. And then again, I already spoke to how we've, basically communicated with our vendors. Anybody that's working for us, and what we're doing is, They have to follow these protocols coming in. They have to social distance. They have to have the mask on. They have to have hand sanitizer with them. So those are things that we're doing. We're also limiting on, we handle our own construction build out. So as we're doing them, instead of having 3 or 4 different trades in there, you might have 1, maybe 2, depending on the size of the build out, just because you can't have all those people in those confined spaces.
Yeah, and from a janitorial standpoint, many of our buildings have day porters in addition to the outside janitorial services at night, the cleaning of the individual spaces. And, so those day porters are cleaning all the common areas throughout the course of the day. And, it's a strain on our staff because it's important to follow up and make sure that these outside vendors are doing what they're required and what we've outlined and told them that they have to do, and making sure that they're doing it. As I'm sure anybody that's in management can attest, janitorial is one of the biggest complaints and one of the biggest, most difficult things to monitor and make sure that it's done properly and to the highest standard. So, Al, I think you would agree that, our property managers, our technicians, all of our people that visit the buildings on a daily basis are now, in addition to their other typical responsibilities, are tasked with really taking and keeping a close eye that this work is being done to the standard that is required.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've also had our property managers and our maintenance staff. We've provided them with, the disinfectant sprays, the disinfectant wipes. So when they're going in and out of a building, we're asking our own staff, hey, wipe the doorknobs that you're using on the way in, wipe the doorknobs on the way out, so that that the tenants see you proactively wiping things down yourself. So it's another thing we've enacted. But yeah, watching the vendors and making sure they're doing, especially janitorial, doing what we've asked them to do, and try to keep things as clean as possible.
And I think it's really important to establish a clean line of communication with the vendors and to make sure that they completely understand what is expected of them, and to give them regular performance reviews. That's what I was thinking of, so that you have a baseline to fall back on. Here, we've required you to do this. You're not doing it. We need you to do it. Those sort of things, especially in light of these heightened requirements. So we're trying to institute these new policies as much as possible.
And we're also communicating with the tenants to make sure that the tenants understand we're not touching your phone, we're not touching your computer, your keyboard. The tenants are going to be required to, take a little bit of responsibility in their office, just so they know where the line of demarcation is. We're not touching monitors, we're not touching computers. Where we're stopping at, and where the tenant needs to take over. That's a huge thing with our tenants as we come back to work.
And we have many tenants, right, Al, that have asked us not to clean their offices.
Yes, absolutely.
We're going to forego our janitorial service. We don't want people coming and going to our space. Obviously, we respect that.
Yes,
absolutely. We have to pay for the janitorial contract, regardless of whether they do it or not. But we acknowledge that, and we'll limit that access when they ask.
And what we've done is we've asked the cleaning company to do a deeper clean on the common areas, because they have freer time, because they're not doing the tenant spaces.
Right.
Hey, Mason, this is Chuck Mitchell in Orlando. One of the things I think we need to realize is that all the things that you guys have mentioned and what a lot of us are doing cost extra money. And so at the end of the year, we just need to realize that it's going to be hard to recapture this extra operating expenses. This fits into what Bill mentioned. It's just going to be hard. The owner's going to have to be eating a lot of this stuff. So we just need to understand that and be talking to the owner regarding that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, many of the buildings that we manage that have capital projects that were planned for this year, if they're essential and they're absolutely necessary, we're still in most instances moving forward. But as you can imagine, most buildings have capital projects that you take on that are, by choice, not necessity. And we, in many instances, have put a hold on a lot of those things, anticipating the not only the costs to operate the buildings might increase or will increase due to these measures that we're putting into place, but also we've been cognizant of the fact that we've got tenants that are struggling that might not pay their rent. So, we could potentially take a hit on the expense and the income side of the ledger. And as a result, we're trying to be as frugal as possible while still obviously maintaining the buildings to the highest level. Would you agree, Al?
Hi.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, did somebody have a comment?
I did. Hi, this is Christina. I'm actually part of Chuck's team. And one of the things we did when this first started is we evaluated actually our trash with all of our different properties and lessened our service for each of the properties that we could, because again, with less tenants in each of the properties, office buildings and retail, we found that we could have less pickup. And it's not a huge savings, but it definitely helped a bit for each of our locations. So that did a little, that helped a little bit with some savings with all the increased for janitorial that we were bringing in for all those properties. So.
That's great.
No, absolutely. And we did realize some of those savings as well with some of our vendors that we could slow off, especially the trash guys. Luckily we have a lot of buildings with 40-yard compactors, which just didn't get emptied for 2 months. So that helped as well. So.
All right, can we go on to the next slide? So effective communication. We've already talked a lot about this. It's important to communicate with our tenants and our vendors. Placing signage around the properties we've already talked about, but we've made it a point of sending out regular emails to our tenants in all of our buildings, alerting them to the measures that we're taking and to the policies that we're putting into place as the buildings open up. The one thing that I would say can't be overemphasized is personal contact. When tenants receive a phone call, or if you see them in the building and you stop and talk to them, and I'm really putting this on the property managers who are actually running the buildings, that personal contact goes a long way. And you stop and say, hey, just want to let you know what's going on in the building, what we're doing. That can't be overemphasized. But sending out the regular alerts is important. Al, did you want to talk a little bit about how we've reached out to our tenants in our buildings?
Yeah, so obviously email is, first choice. And, the other thing we did when we reached out, we also had conference calls with most of our larger tenants just to see what we needed to do to accommodate them on their way back into the office and what they were seeing and how they wanted to do things. So that we did as well. We also asked all the tenants if there were other people, because you have your general in offices, you have your 3 or 4 people you would email. Were there people that we wanted to add in addition to that as things are changing in the building? We also had, we had to deal with a couple positive COVID cases in buildings and communicate with our tenants, i.e. letting them know that it happened, but you couldn't get into specifics because of HIPAA of who the person was. But we've been communicating via text and email and a lot of conference calls and Zoom calls and Zoom meetings where we've communicated with the tenants on them coming back into work, what we needed to do, how we were handling things. So, but definitely text, cell phone, text, phone calls, emails, and face-to-face as best you can with some of the tenants, obviously keeping the distance there. So.
Yeah, and then the other thing is, we alluded to it earlier, we do get complaints from tenants that, see things that they don't like. And, and in many instances, we might think they're somewhat frivolous complaints, but that's not our place. We stated it earlier, people are concerned and many times they're scared to come back to work. They're not sure, what to expect. So, we have asked all of our people within our organization when they receive complaints or criticisms or questions to express as much sympathy or empathy as possible for our tenants and for our clients, and address criticisms and comments head on, no matter how frivolous we might think it is, or in some instances we might think it's a silly complaint. No complaint is a silly complaint in our estimation. Address them head on, address them in a very prompt manner, and that'll get you further than I think just sort of sidestepping the issue. And we're trying to be as proactive as possible. Any other comments on communication? Oh, the other thing I mentioned too is, we also encourage in a very professional way for tenants and vendors and anybody that's involved in the operation or occupancy of our buildings to take some personal responsibility too. We do push back when it's appropriate. Say, you know what, we're here to put the policy in place, but it's really up to you to manage your employees and your people with your organization to follow these rules. And we do put it back on them a little bit when it's appropriate, of course, to do so, and try and push some personal responsibility, because really that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. Unless there's any other comments, can we go to the next slide? So managing tenant issues. So this is kind of shifting gears to tenant defaults, tenant requests for rent deferments, and how we've handled those situations. So, and I know we've talked about this in previous Zoom calls, so I don't know, how much detail we want to get into, but I felt it, Al and I felt it was important to talk about because it does take up a lot of our business time from a management standpoint. We are still being inundated, maybe not as much as we were in the initial stages of COVID, with requests to defer rents. We have met those requests almost on an exclusive basis initially with, we're not in a position to adjust your rent or give any deferments. And for the most part, the smaller medium companies that were able to apply for their PPP loans, and especially the ones that did receive money, they've continued to pay their rent. I would say that 95% of the tenants in our buildings, Al, wouldn't you say, have paid their rent, even though many have asked for special circumstances. And we push back on that. We always try to again, express sympathy and empathy for their situation. We don't want to come off as hard because, when their leases come up for renewal 3 years from now, they're going to remember that we didn't work with them. But if you explain it the right way, they've been understanding for the most part. We do have other tenants, and some larger ones specifically, let's face it, that we have worked with. And we have provided some reworking of lease structures. And, we've got 2 instances specifically in mind, 2 larger tenants in our portfolio. One in particular that has a 7-year remaining lease term, and they had the right to terminate their lease after, I don't know, maybe 4 years left on their lease, or 3 years left on their lease, 4 years from now. And we gave this tenant some rental relief. I think we gave them 2 or 3 months. We cut their rent in half for 2 or 3 months. But in exchange for that, we required them to remove their early termination right. And they agreed to that. Another tenant, we agreed to cut their rent in half for 3 months, and they're paying it back on an amortized basis starting June or January 1 of 21. It's our attitude that if we do give you a reduction in rent, that in most instances you have to pay it back. We're not giving free rent. There's got to be some avenue for either payback or some change in your lease that is advantageous for the landlord. It's got to be a give and take. It's got to be beneficial to both sides. And when it's presented in the proper fashion, we've been very successful with that.
Well, and I would only add one thing to that, Mason, that we've ran into as well. We also have some landlords and owners that have some CMBS loans, which are real tricky when you start giving free rent and adding it to the term of the lease, because with CMBS loans, and those of you that have them know they're you lose your personal guarantee, your client does, but there's also some restrictions there. And one is you can't rework a lease that's not inside of 12 months. So giving free rent and putting it on the end of the lease is technically a carve out. And you could, for your client, if you don't handle those things absolutely correctly, you could spring the recourse back on your client because you've taken away some of the lender's collateral. So I just say that be real careful if you have a CMBS loan, that you understand what you can and cannot do. We've went through our loan documents, and that we have tenants that were quite upset with us, medical tenants especially, that their business was completely shut down and it's now completely changed. And we were unable to do anything for them because of the lending situation on the building. You know, they were with it, just had renewed early, you know, they just had renewed, there was plenty of term on the lease, and we had no ability to change it. And that was a difficult conversation we had to have. So I just wanted to bring that up as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, Al. Al and Joel asked about our retail tenants. We don't do very much retail. As I mentioned when the session started, the vast majority of our properties are office and medical properties. So if anybody has any experience with retail tenants that are on the call, I'd encourage any comment.
Mason, hey, it's Alan.
Yeah.
We do a lot of retail, and especially restaurants. And we had to, while we didn't give any concessions to the office tenants for the most part, kind of like what you had mentioned, that guys, you got to pay your rent. The retail side of it, especially the restaurants, we had to give them abatement of rent, not deferment, I should say, not abatement. But we had to pretty much across the board have to give it to all of them because of the nature of what happened and how they were directly affected by this more so than pretty much everybody else.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know in Detroit, Dan Gilbert with Quicken Loans owns a company called Bedrock. He owns 90 buildings in Detroit. He's really been very successful and really led the resurgence in our city. And Bedrock came out very proactively right off the bat with their retail tenants, many of the restaurants, and they provided rental abatements to a lot of tenants. I think they viewed it as, you know, they're basically partners in many respects with these retail tenants. If they fail, the city of Detroit is going to struggle and it's going to hurt them in the end. So all circumstances are different, obviously, but there's a good example where on the retail side of things, they felt the need to do something proactive.
In Las Vegas, a lot of our landlords were very proactive, which we were so grateful for. They early on decided what a deferred program would be, and we reached out to all of the tenants so that that fear factor was lessened, which really helped. And we did a lot of deferments. We did do some, just like you did, Alan, for the restaurants. We reduced some of the rents. However, we asked, what were you doing for PPP? Give us your financial information. So we asked for some backup, and there were a few that chose not to give us that, and that speaks volumes to a different outcome. However, we wanted to also give them everything that we knew of as it relates to the city of Las Vegas. If they had any measures that they could put in place for grants. So we've been proactive there, but it started really, the things that really helped us with the heavy lifting early on was landlords stepping up and saying, let's blanket this out to all of our tenants. And because no different than you guys, this 18-hour days, they're still here and they're still real. But the retail environment has been heavy hit. And this month, we're tracking every week our rental incomes across our different areas. And we're about 81% of collected rents. Now that's with the deferred, but even with the retail, we're in the high 70s. So we're hoping that continues.
That's great.
Great, that's great.
But if I can come back on a point there, in France, there has been a law that if you're a small enterprise under 1 million in income and less than 10 employees, that your landlord has to give you a deferment of the rent for the close down and maybe some others. So laws interfered. It sounds like you haven't got that in America yet. But the next thing is that everybody knows that we now have also another law, which I'm sure must be the case in America, whereby you can defer your amortization of your loan and your interest payments for up to 6 months. People are getting to their banks and they're asking not to pay back. Now that's a vicious circle. That's a circle because it gets back to the businesses. And I'd be interested to. We need to have this conversation again in about October when America has headed towards rock bottom of the economy. Because it's going to be a very different world, and they're going to be looking for they're going to hang landlords that have proven to be just intolerant all the way through. It's going to be a really unclever thing to have been that hard landlord. So there are, I'm saying the word abatements, guys, that you need to be proactive. I know it looks good in your clients. Someone was talking about CMBS rules, but I can tell you that there is not going to be a foreclosure on a CMBS law because somebody was 20% of his rent short for a particular year because of this basis. It is absolutely a defense. And maybe you'll say there are hard-asked lawyers in New York, so that'll take you to task. But you have to yield in advance, break and advise your tenants, your landlord, sorry, your clients, earlier rather than later. Be at the beginning of the curve, because it's going to be horrible in America from October onwards. Bloodbath of businesses.
This is Atlanta. This is Al in Atlanta. I agree with what you're saying. However, most of these CMBS loans, which we have one as well, they're going to want to control your situation. And what they're going to do is they're going to put you in a lockbox scenario. Yeah. Where you are not able to distribute any funds at all, and they kind of totally control your building. So I think it's less the guarantee that you have to worry about, and more in the lockbox where all of a sudden the lender is now in control of your building and they're deciding what you can and can't do.
Yeah. But what if the crowd start attacking the headquarters of the CMBS loans, and there's an attack? Bit like we're seeing on your police force.
Well, we've got plenty of those people. We were happy to say, give me the address and I'll send them their way.
It's not going to be clever to say you're CMBS banker in October.
Yeah. Well, don't you ever heard we're going to have a V economy? It's going to be by October. It's going to be all back to normal. We'll be good. The other thing is, I'll just point out, is that we have been successful collecting the rents, and most tenants, and again, I'm speaking to office. Retail, I know, is a different world, but we have collected probably 95% of the rents. And now, but we are starting to see, especially some of our smaller mom and pop type tenants, we're starting to get some defaults, and we're starting to see some businesses that have said, I can't make it anymore, and we're closing shop. And mainly the smaller tenants, of course, your travel agencies and tenants like that, service and businesses that rely on the public. So there's going to be some fallout there for sure. But those businesses were not going to make it regardless of whether or not we gave them a rent deferment or not. That's more systematic with their business, not necessarily the landlord-tenant relationship. So again, it just goes to, how are you budgeting your income and expenses for your property? Because there's going to be some of that fallout. That's going to happen. And we're just now starting to see, June, July, going into these months where now, these tenants this has been ongoing for a number of months now, and they just can't withhold anymore. They can't keep their businesses going. Can we go to the last slide, unless anybody has anything else to talk about tenant issues? Because I know we're coming up on an hour here. Can we move on to the last one? Thank you. So the last thing we want to talk about, and Al, you alluded to it a little earlier, and Al, you're really the expert here on this, especially. What happens when you have a positive case of COVID in one of the properties that you manage? What steps do you take? What protocols do you put into place? And I'll tee it up for Al, and he can kind of explain, but we do have one building in one of the suburban Detroit communities that is 60% occupied by a international logistics firm, and they had a positive case, and they required us to come in and disinfect the building professionally. So Al, maybe if you could talk a little bit about what protocols and processes we put into place when we do get notice that somebody's been infected, and what steps we take in different circumstances.
So thank you, Mason. So what we did is obviously, first off, communicated with the tenant to find out, when was the person in the building last, and went back on the calendar to see what dates we were. And we knew we had a possible infection, and they were in the building, whether they were positive or negative at that point, they were in the building. We chose to bring in, us and the tenant chose to bring in a third party, basically your flood and fire restoration people. They were coming in and doing the cleanings and the certifications to get it all done. And they basically fogged the entire building. We closed the building down for 48 hours while we did the fogging. We went in and replaced all the filters after the fogging was done and put new filters in the system. notified all the tenants in the building that we did have a positive case. And again, completely fogged the tenant space as well as all the common areas. And then the landlord that we happen to represent here wanted to go ahead and do the entire building. So we went into each and every other tenant space and did that and let them know. We also had 3 false positives where we were told we had a person and went in and did the cleaning, went in and did the protocols, went in and notified all the tenants, and just to come find out it was a false positive. They went back in and were retested, and it was a false positive. I see the one who paid for this. The big one, the big tenant that knew it was one of their employees that had it, they paid for their share, and our landlord absorbed the other share of the cost. On the false positives, the landlord absorbed the cost for the building and the other tenant spaces, and we charged back the tenant for their share of the cleaning since they brought the positive hit into the building. That's how we've handled it so far. And knock on wood, we've only had a few. We only had the one out of 39 properties that was actually truly a positive. And we manage a very large medical portfolio. So, but our landlord, our tenants that were medical were pre-screening each patient prior to them coming in, because what we saw, and not that this, how did we manage it, but what we saw with the medical groups is when the hospitals were so overwhelmed, our orthopedic groups and our subspecialty groups were actually taking emergency room cases and they were derailing them and sending them to our orthopedic and our hand clinics and our subspecialists, so they didn't even come through the ER. So we are seeing quite a bit of activity there. So, and I'm sorry, I didn't see the one question that popped up.
How did you get confirmation of the false positives, Al?
So the tenants, because these were medical, the false positives were all medical. So they were constantly communicating with the people and then, testing early on. Oh, you have it. Then they'd circle back 3 days later and say, oh no, you were a false positive. So the tenant was communicating back to us because they were communicating through to their patient.
Yeah, and just to go back to the cost. So the one instance that Al was talking about where we fogged the building, the large corporate tenant who has 60% of the building, they really insisted that we take these measures. They're a long-term tenant. They're the biggest tenant in the building. And luckily we have a landlord in that instance who felt it was important to accommodate them, because we equally felt that it was important to accommodate them. And from a cost standpoint, to do the whole building, that building's a 70,000 square foot, 2-story office building. They occupy 60% of it. And I think, Al, what was it, maybe $12,000 or $13,000 to do the whole disinfectant for the whole building?
We had budgeted $12,000 or $13,000 because it was a time and material job, but the whole job ended up coming in under $10,000. It was $9,600.
Yeah. So and then the tenant paid for 60% of that cost. So yes. It's a cost, but it went a long way towards tenant relations with that company. We were on top of it. We took care of it. We did it in a professional manner. We vetted out the company that was going to come in and disinfect the building and what the process was. And we did it professionally, and they really did appreciate the service.
And that was one where from a company standpoint, we chose not to use the local cleaning company that we use in that building. We went to the third-party professionals just to isolate that as well. So.
Any other questions or comments? I know we're coming up here on an hour, right on the nose. So
Mason, hey, this is Chuck in Orlando again. One of the things I would just encourage the property managers to think about is isolating these COVID costs in your budget, in your operating budget. So when it comes to time for coming up with a value of that building, these will be kind of one-offs, and so you can take those out very easily. It's easier to just roll them into the different line items you already have. But if you separate those out, they'll be easy to take those out to determine the value of the building.
That's a great point.
Yeah, it's a great point. Great point.
Any other comments or questions?
Hi, this is Heather from Atlanta, Heather Probst from Atlanta, and I actually work for Alan. But I have a question. We had a case yesterday where we have a medical facility in one of our buildings, and we have since found out that one of their patients has COVID. And I just didn't know if any of you have any advice for us on what we can do legally, you know, without, I guess, affecting his rights, but also protecting all of the tenants and the visitors and the clients of our building.
Yeah, you want to take that?
And you know the person that has COVID was in the building?
Yeah, he was a patient at one of our medical facilities, and they confirmed it with our security guard, but he keeps coming back to the building, and I'm trying to figure out how we handle that situation without, like you were saying, people coming back and all of a sudden, you know, we're faced with some legal issues.
So he continues to come back to the building?
He's come back. I think he came back yesterday twice, and the security guard asked him to leave. And I'm just trying to figure out, how do we protect ourselves? And then how do we protect the tenants to make sure that he doesn't come back in until he gets help? Because apparently, I guess he was in the hospital, and then he got out of the hospital. And then since he's been out of the hospital, he keeps trying to come back in.
Well, the trying to come back in, I have no aim other than to tell him he can't come back in, because, you know, here, if you have it, you're required to be quarantined for 14 days and not moving about, you know, go out and about at all. B, I think you have to let your tenants know that you had a positive in the building, and make sure they're taking the steps in theirs. You know, I think the best thing there is communicate with your tenants, and then make sure that wherever path this person followed, that we know he followed, I'd make sure it was disinfected and you know, and cleaned as best you can. But the biggest thing is, I think, would be communicate with the tenants and let them know.
But the other question, Heather, is this individual is coming to see one of the tenants in your building?
Yeah, he was trying to go back upstairs into his the medical office. He's a patient
Of the medical tenant.
no matter what I say, he's a Grady patient, so he has wanted to come back in, and I might be able to I could probably pull up some information to give the security guard to give to him to say, you're supposed to be in quarantine for 14 days.
Yeah.
Go back and communicate with Grady and
This is also an indigent person that's not mentally all stable. So we've got a lot of issues here.
Yeah.
And they have the top positive test result to know that it's 100% an actual positive, or he said he tested positive.
We don't know. This is all hearsay. We've been told, the security guard told us that he's positive. That's what they told her, but
so
we don't have any proof.
Yeah, I just put in the chat. In the state of Florida, the medical facility can contact the health department if they're their patient to actually request the test results. It's one of the things that they're allowed to do. So you can actually contact your tenant and let them know that they can reach out to the health department and see. But in the state of Florida, our medical providers are allowed to reach out to the health department and say, I had a patient come in who said they tested positive or negative, and they can actually request that documentation from the health department. So that may be true in whatever state you're in as well.
Probably same with Georgia. Unfortunately, this is the health department.
Oh.
Oh boy. Well, I don't have anything for you there, because if it's the health department, I would hope they know how to handle it.
Well, the guy, well, that's a good question. We're gonna have that's why we're asking the question. Good question, Heather.
That's a great question.
I think they would turn him away.
They did. The security guard came down to kick him out, but he's still walking in our building, and we can't. He's walking in the lobby, and before he gets in the lobby, kick him out, but he's still walking through the door.
So you have a security guard in that building?
Mm-hmm.
We have 6 security guards in that building.
Oh, okay.
And
we have nurses at the front who take the temp. Like you're not supposed to be able to go in if you have a temperature. So you're not supposed to able to go in at all. But because of the issues that Alan said, sometimes people don't always respect that. And this is one of those people.
Yeah.
Sounds
And,
like you've got to have your security guards on alert to stop the guy at the front door.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments before we wrap up? Well, thank you, everybody. Jonathan, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything
No,
to
just
close.
Mason and Al, thank you guys. This was excellent. We had 31 at the peak, 31 people at the peak, and just great exchange. So like I said earlier, this will was recorded. We'll send it out to everybody. Appreciate you guys being here. And if you have any ideas for future topics, let the staff know, please.
okay. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
everybody.
everybody.
Take care,
Thank
guys.
you.
For tuning in.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.